Hey guys, today we're going to talk about some traumatic brain as part of a homeostatic imbalance for the central nervous system. March was, we're a little delayed with everything that's gone on this year, but March was Brain Injury Awareness Month. And last year it happened to add up perfectly. We were able to talk about the nervous system during March, but we're a little delayed this year, but that's okay. But the four that we're going to talk about: concussion, brain contusion, intracranial hemorrhage, and cerebral edema. Okay, concussion. Concussion is the first one. Concussion is not something that's new. I think everybody in this room knows of someone, if not themselves, that's had a concussion. Okay. Concussion often is confused with the second one, brain contusion. Okay, I've had many times where I've had local family doctors tell me that a kid didn't have a concussion, they had a brain contusion. Okay, when we get into contusion, you'll understand why that's disturbing. Okay, that doctors will say that it's not a concussion, it's just a contusion. Okay, but a concussion is when the injury to the brain is actually very slight. Okay, as far as structural damage. Okay, the victim may be dizzy, have a headache, may lose consciousness, may see stars, may have some ringing in their ears. All of those things are symptoms of a concussion. A concussion, just as an FYI, a concussion cannot be seen on a CT scan. Every year I have athletes that come in and say that, you know, they had been taken to the ER for a concussion, suspected concussion, and that the doctor was able to rule it out because the CT scan was clear. Okay. A concussion is more of an issue with the function of the brain, okay, rather than damage to the brain. Okay, that's a very important differential to make, because often we think that you can see damage to the brain, like if we were to do some imaging, if we were able to do an MRI or a CT scan, that we would see damage to the brain like we would for a knee. Okay, but you cannot see damage to the brain from a concussion. There isn't damage to the brain from a concussion. Okay, but it's more in the function and how the brain is working. The second one, then, the brain contusion, is there is actual tissue damage on the brain. Okay, if you'll look at this second picture, or this picture right here, when we're talking about brain contusions, okay, this first one is very obvious. Hard, heavy object falls down on the brain. Okay, you can see this damage here, this tissue damage in that picture to the brain. Okay, this is something that happens very often in sport. Take a ball to the front of the head. Okay, and the damage is done right here in the front of the brain, right where the impact was made. This last one, and maybe the most unsettling one, is where the brain, the head hits the front of hits something on the front of its head. Okay, so we run into a wall, and we hit the wall with such impact that the brain gets shifted forward and then hits that wall and bounces back. Okay, and that's where we get this damage on the back of the brain. You can see the brain damage, the tissue damage on the back of the brain. Okay, so the head has gone forward, hit something hard, so the brain kind of shifts forward and then hits this hard surface and gets jarred back, and we end up with damage on the back of the brain. Okay, you can see in the lower picture here the brain contusion, where there is actually some damage. Okay, if we use the word contusion with anything, it's talking about kind of a bruising, maybe a little bit of bleeding, but some damage to the tissue. Okay, so if we see brain contusion, we're actually talking about damage to the brain tissue. It's not just a breakdown in the function. brain contusions and concussions often go hand in hand. Okay. If we have a brain contusion, we almost always have a concussion. If we have a concussion, we don't necessarily have to have a contusion. If we have a concussion and we know about it and we take care of it and pull that person out and rest them, then we don't worry about the contusion necessarily. The third one, intracranial hemorrhaging. Okay, intra meaning within, cranial, cranium, hemorrhage. So bleeding on the brain. Okay, bleeding from a ruptured blood vessel of the brain. Death may result. Okay, these are very serious. These we see on a CT scan. Okay, so you go to the doctor, you have a suspected concussion, you go to the you see your friendly athletic trainer, she sends you to the doctor, and you go to the hospital and they do a CT, and the CT comes back positive. You're going to see one of these on there. You're going to see bleeding from a ruptured blood vessel, and that is very, very bad. Okay, so when people come in and say, good news, I didn't have anything on my CT scan, I can play, wrong. Okay, if we have something, it's going to be major life altering. Okay, if we have bleeding on the brain. We did have one instance in the last, it's probably been longer ago than I think, but we did have one kid that boys basketball player went up in a sectional game, went to, I think, kind of block the ball or block a shot, and kind of got flipped around, and his head hit the floor first. Okay, landed on his back, busted his eye open, and immediately just blood everywhere. It's on the face. Faces bleed like crazy. So we covered up his face. We got him off to the side. We talked to him about going to get a staple or a few stitches. His parents were there. It was a sectional game, of course. And concussion was no concussion symptoms, no headache, just localized pain, no dizziness, no ringing in his ears, nothing like that. All we thought was just a simple, a few stitches and he would be back in business. Okay, we thought he'd definitely be back for our next sectional game. Got to the hospital, they did a CT scan, which was a great decision, and they ended up finding an old brain bleed. Okay, he was removed from that season. He didn't get to return. And luckily it was an old one, but the CT scan lit up that he had bleeding on the brain, and very, very scary. Okay. The last one, cerebral edema. Okay, swelling of the brain due to an inflammatory response of injury. Okay, cerebral, meaning the cerebrum. Edema, we know that is fluid leaking into the tissues. Okay. These are very, very serious things. Okay. Car accidents, shaken baby syndrome, being hit by a really blunt, heavy object, blood clot in the case of a stroke. We're going to get more into that tomorrow. Brain hemorrhaging, brain tumors, carbon monoxide poisoning. Very, very bad things, okay, cause cerebral edema. And the symptoms are much more extensive. You're not going to see an intracranial hemorrhage most often without any major concussion signs. Okay, that the basketball player that we had been talking about, when the parents called me and said that they found a brain bleed, I was just shocked, actually completely in shock. Our coach was completely surprised. Mr. Hickman was completely surprised because he did not present like a normal brain bleed would. Most of the time, those are like crazy symptoms, not knowing where they're at, not being able to walk, sometimes not being able to talk. Okay. So most of the time, it's not a standard concussion symptoms that you see. So I don't want everyone to be freaking out thinking that every time they have hit their head, they've got cerebral edema or an intracranial hemorrhage going on. Okay. Most of the time, those symptoms are so severe that you notice that it's something major that we need to go get checked out. Okay, those are the 4 types of traumatic brain injury that we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to do a little activity on concussion in sport. There's an article for you to read and then some questions for you to answer. Take a look at those, and that's all for today.